Greetings, nerds. This is Scene and Nerd. I'm your host, Sarah Belmont, and with me, as always, is our Mr. Producer, Will Paul. How are you doing tonight, Will?
Doing very well, Sarah.
We are going to discuss the last two episodes of season 2. We have Reindeer Shames and Deer and Loathing in Drum Kingdom. Will, what did you think about the conclusion of One Piece season 2?
So, a tear may have been shed for in One Piece season 2, getting Chopper's backstory and all. It was really again, haven't read any of the manga or anything like that, but I will say that I really enjoyed learning more about Chopin's origin story and how Luffy and how and the rest of the crew was able to talked about it, and then just the satisfying conclusion of what was all built up in episode 7, which I think was my favorite episode of the series so far. We do get the beautiful cherry blossoms there, at the as they're on the Mary, and I will freely admit I definitely teared up with that.
So we're just talking about episode 7 right now.
I know.
I think this episode was fine. I didn't tear up. I kept being like, okay, and the story ends and we're back in no. We're still doing this. Okay, it's going to continue. It's going to be continuing. I really do like Chopper. I just, for some reason, was not vibing with Hiriluk, but it was necessary, and it explained more about not just Chopper, but Drum Kingdom as a whole. We've seen a lot of outsiders' perspectives with Vivi over Drum Kingdom, so now we're getting kind of, through conversations with Dalton, we also learn about the history of Drum Kingdom, but this Reindeer Shames really offers a look at the wool of it all. I'm horrible with names and these characters. I so apologize if I offend anybody. But Will just made me spend 45 minutes on Paradise. So now we're trying to rein it in, pun intended. And the thing about the cherry blossoms that I really wanted to have explained, but they did not, but I do suspect a connection, is Miss All Day Sunday. There's a reason why her powers always start with cherry blossoms. And I don't think it's a coincidence that that pirate flag had the cherry blossoms and her ability. Like, there is definitely a connection. I don't know what it is, and I don't want to know, even though I kind of do. But I was stuck on that the whole time. I was like, okay, so we're going to hear more. But to me, both of these episodes, when combined, they are a very good chapter. But it was weird for me, if I look at the entire season, that they concluded on this chapter where I'm just like, we've spent so much time with all of the Baroque works that these last two episodes, they took a backseat to Drum Kingdom. And I was just like, oh, so we're not going to return to that. That will just be a storyline that continues in the next season. And so will this whole Alabasta of it all. So it was weird. Again, I don't know what it is. We just talked about one season 2 finale that felt awkward to me. And again, the decision to tell certain stories, it just didn't feel, in my opinion, like a conclusion of this season. It felt more like a chapter in this season, like a 2-episode arc. And then they were going to return and there was going to be something else. So I don't know. As an overall, if I look at it from that perspective, I don't know if it was the best way to conclude this season. But the episodes themselves were fine. They were consistent with the stories that we've been told this season, if that makes sense.
Baroque Works was always, to me, always in the present. So even though I know we spent time with these last episodes about Drum Kingdom, I mean, I think the overall, the spirit or the vibe of Broke Works was like over this because Mr. Crocodile, Mr. Zero, which we learned is later, Mr. Crocodile was it was the one who provided King Walpole with the with the devil fruit and took advantage out with Alabasta, the civil the civil war between the war
Yeah,
between the two kingdoms and stuff. I mean, those are all to me were all being influenced by the works.
yeah, that's a
So
fair point that they were pulling the
yeah,
strings for this conflict that was occurring.
yeah,
And it definitely, I mean, if in terms of the season, does seem to all have been about getting Vivi on board as a straw hat and then also now getting Chopper on board as a fellow. So like I don't know if the crew is finished, but I do feel like okay, this can we be finished for season 3 and maybe tell some stories with our crew members now, like the Usup arc that we had with like the 5th and 6th episode, if that makes sense.
yeah. Well, I mean, again, and I think this is just where, obviously for folks who are familiar with the source material, will could definitely educate us on what we're all missing here. But to me, I think you need it to your point, as you said, you're bringing Chopper, you're bringing Viv together with the whole crew, so that now as we move to the next set of adventures, and we the one thing I did like is that they resolved what was going on here in Drum Kingdom by having Dalton and the townspeople take out the army, take Luffy taking out King Walpole, which he's like the devil fruit basically made him into like a transformer, which is pretty dope when he saw all the with their fights and all that kind of stuff. So all the so to me it was good that they just kind of wrapped the Drum Kingdom chapter up so that, okay, to your point, now when we go to subsequent seasons we can focus on the next chapters in the story.
Yeah, because now we got to go to Alabasta.
Yeah, yep,
We got to
yeah,
work our way in Alabasta.
yep.
We to add Chopper and conclude Drum Kingdom, though we also sacrificed the Marines, and I finally remembered his name for once. Cole.
Yeah,
Next, no Colby this season, which was a
yeah.
kind of a shocker. And then I was like, okay, well that's fine because we're getting to Shaggy and Smoker.
Mhm.
And then suddenly they took a back seat, and I'm like, okay, well the
Yeah.
Marines that were very interesting served in a very like mirroring way to the Straw Hats, while at the same time, like think about a triangle. So you have Straw Hats, you have the Marines, and then you have whatever evil pirate villains there are at the other end.
Yeah.
So, but I feel like in this season we got very much the Straw Hats and the evil pirate villains, and not so much of the Marines. And maybe they're saving that because they are like playing a long game. I totally understand that.
Yeah, to that point, I'm glad. Actually, in a way, I'm actually glad that they kind of let the Marines sort of take a back seat, because there was a lot going on that they had to just cover here, and especially these last two episodes. In particular, we have to, because we are introducing to, we mid season we got we got BB's story, and we were introduced to her, and how she and we do learn that she was
Princess of
trying to
Alabasta.
Princess Alabaster, and all and her role in that, as far as just trying to infiltrate Broke Works and learn what she needs to help protect the kingdom. And then in this episode, yeah, these last two, we really get Chopper's story. Of course we get the quick introduction to Chopper, at the end of episode 6, whenever they were trying to, get Nami's, to the doctor. So to that point, I'm glad, so I think it would have been way too much if they had, I think they had the right amount of Marines, so they didn't get they didn't take them completely off the table, but they had just enough little appetizers for them in this season that to remind us that they're there, but and for example, with Smoker and to having their moments in the previous episodes and in these episodes too, as far as intercepting the messages and hearing what Sanchi and Mr. Zero messages going back and forth when they were on Wax Out. So yeah, so I think that was the appropriate amount of what we needed of the Marines this season, so that whenever we do get to the third season, which is in production right now, so hopefully won't be as long of a break between this season and the next. We'll get back to them full speed ahead.
Yeah. We they love to build. They're building a world, that is for sure.
Yeah.
They're building a world, and I know we're gonna get back to them and everything. I guess in a way, it almost feels like we need or I need 2 more episodes for this season. and I probably don't, because less is always more. But I'm just having issues tonight with finales and character arcs. And if I think about Luffy, who's our captain, our king of the Straw Hats, who wants to be king of the pirates, he didn't really go. He's the same Luffy, for better or for worse, at the start of the season and at the end of the season. And I guess that's the point. I guess that's the point of Luffy. And it's just about all of these characters interacting with him and meeting him and him bringing out something in them, which we do see with Vivi and the others. Like Nami hints at it. Zoro certainly hints at it. So it's just different. And I'm not saying it's bad or anything. I'm just not accustomed to it. And so that's why, if I'm being honest, it still feels a bit awkward of a way to conclude a season to me. But then again, they, like you said, season 3 is in production. So they know this is a continuation. And so this very much feels to me like what we were just talking about before with Paradise, like it's a bridge season. And then again, where those two shows differ, though, is this one is also based on the longest running manga of all time. Well, I'm like, okay, so how many bridge seasons are we going to get?
I don't know if it's I mean, I hear where you're coming from with the bridge season, but I think all of these are going to be bridge seasons until, because the story is still going. Well, I mean, I know they do have a plan for the live action to wrap it up. I think, I've heard everything from 6 seasons to maybe, or maybe longer. But I get your point. Well, you'll go back to Luffy. I think Luffy's Luffy. I mean, where I think with our other characters, you do see, I guess, more almost, maybe I don't want to overuse the word dramatic growth, but you definitely see a change with all our characters. I mean, between seasons 1 and 2, as far as the Straw Hats, and we learned, like, for example, when Sanchi and Nami were talking about how his backstory as far as where he learned how to cook, and it provided some greater depth for him, and maybe so compared to that, we didn't get as much of that, even though Dr. Correa did. I did like that moment whenever she and Dalton were on the whenever they were leaving at the end of episode 8, and it brought back Goldie Roger again. So to me, that was a good, putting it again, reminding us again that connection between Luffy and Goldie, and which we got at the beginning of the season, and they just reminded us that here at the end of the season as we move to the third. So yeah, so so for me, that was I was satisfied with that, and I think that's what really made one of many reasons that made these episodes stand out. And then also, I know you weren't big fans of Dr. Hiriluk, but you know I going back to episode 7 real fast with his relationship with Chopper and the bond that they created there. I mean, I guess that's why when I started my comments tonight, where I was like with episode, I started immediately with episode 8 was just because some tears were shed, was because I did really enjoy seeing that bond, and why I think episode 7 really resonated with me so much this season, as far as my favorite for this season, was just that nurturing, that bond that was formed between the two of them, but also just how the sort of push pull that you have in relationships. And one of the things I really enjoy about this show, I mentioned it last week, and I'll do it again here, is the range of emotions that they can do comedy, they can do drama, they can do action adventure, and 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 to that point about the relationship, how some, I guess when Chopper was, whenever things got too close or too uncomfortable for Dr. Hiriluk, he, because of all the things going on there on Drum Island, with the hunting down the doctors and then hunting
Well,
Chopper
he got
down and
sick.
everything. Yeah,
He
and
got
he
he
got
got
sick.
sick, and he didn't want Chopper to see him die.
Yeah, so that was just, that, and so he used the anger, and used and use the things that use the wedge that people who know you best will hurt, and to drive Chopper away. But at the end of the day, Chopper still loved him so much that, I know what you're doing here, Doc. I'm gonna come back because I want to be a doctor. I want to learn from you. And then, and then seeing Correa doing the same thing later. And if I'm butchering her name, forgive me again.
Mhm.
But that same dynamic too, where where she was happy, she knew that he had to leave the island to go with the Straw Hats, but at the same time, she had also bonded with Chopper, and it was, and her hurt of having to see him go, how to articulate it, and and then she also had that same kind of feeling with Hiriluk as
Well, I think it's like hope
yeah,
was the ultimate cure, is that you were
yeah,
dealing with people in a hopeless situation, and so
yeah,
at
yeah,
the end, that's what they needed. That was the medicine, was hope and the willing to just be good and pure, and that's
yeah,
what Chopper presents. And the innocence of Chopper, who thinks he figured it out, he did the thing, and it wasn't the cure all, and it's the exact thing that worried Kira, is
mm,
hope also kills people, because
yeah, yeah,
you got to be skeptical. So it is a very interesting dynamic that they brought up there, in terms of medicine and cures and outsiders and insiders and the class system and all of that,
yeah,
within Drum Kingdom. So
yeah,
so I give it that. And again, Chopper is just adorable. So it's hard
yeah,
not to like Chopper and not to want to protect him at all costs. Totally understand why Kura didn't want to say goodbye, but ultimately, she she be good.
yeah.
And I think we're gonna see her again. I mean, there's a
Oh
reason
yeah,
why left her and Dalton where they did with Drum Island. And so, all right. Well, I think on that note, that lets us conclude One Piece season 2. Will, why don't you tell our listeners where they can find you? You can find me there too at SJ Belmont, SJBELMONT. Please follow our crew on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Scene and Nerd, on Blue Sky. Friend us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram and Threads at Scene_Ed_Nerd. And visit our website, www.sceneandnerdpodcast.com. But most importantly, rate, follow, and comment on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Good night, Geek Out. You're welcome.